evening, ladies and gentlemen. And first off, I want to thank you for this marvelous opportunity to renew my friendship with Naples. The memories came back in a big hurry when I walked out on that pier yesterday. The first thing I met was a small sheephead about that long that came flying up out of the water and landed at my feet. And I thought, not as big as I used to catch. And somehow or other they shrunk. It's the only thing in Naples I've seen that's smaller than it used to be. This is the biggest town I ever saw. And I don't know how it ever got to be this size, because really, truly, it just looks like a wonderland. I mean, when you can think back to where I knew Naples when it was so little that it barely existed. But it's a great pleasure to come and talk to you about it, and I'll try to give you some of an idea of what it looked like and what it was like when I was down here. When I came down in 1921 with my mother and father and my younger sister, Jenny. And the reason we were here was that father hadn't been very well, and he worked awfully hard. He was in the coal business in Columbus, Ohio, and he was a hard worker, and he wasn't feeling well. So mother, with the best intentions in the world, thought if she got him away where he couldn't do any work and he didn't have anything to worry about, that he'd get a lot of rest and would improve his health and everything would be better. Well, that didn't work out terribly well, because when father got down here, there was nothing in Naples, really, truly nothing. Let me describe it for you a little bit so you can get it set in your mind's eye as I go along with what went on down here. There was one main street in Naples, and that went right down the center of town and ended at the pier. The hotel was at the other end, and that was the one main street there was. There were two other little streets that went one place or another. They were all sand and shell. And there wasn't a foot of macadam anywhere around here. There was one road to Fort Myer. It was single track, sand road. And if you went to Fort Myer, you had to tell everybody else in town you were going so they could give you the errands to do because they didn't want to go. And the deal was that the protocol was that when you were going up to Fort Myer, if you met somebody coming down, after much honking and yelling at one another, you decided which one was going to pull off into the woods. And whoever pulled off into the woods and let you pass, you had to get out of your car and help to dig them out so they could go on where they were going. And standard equipment to go to Fort Myers for the day was a shovel. Because when you got out of that sand track road, you were in trouble. Really, you had to get somebody to dig you out. And if you ever encountered anybody who had no manners and went off and left you, they were practically put on the most wanted list. I mean, if you ever got them, you'd kill them. But the houses on the beach consisted of the following. When you went down, if you go down to the pier right now and stand with your back to the pier and look up the main drag of Naples, the first house on the right was the Bruce Halderman's house. A lovely, low-slung porched house. It had a beautiful porch that went all the way around it. It was a big, sprawling house, and she had the only lovely garden in town. It was a beautiful garden. It was there before Ann Bruce, who, of course, was a great horticulturist. I take most of the credit for the garden because I must have given to Mrs. Bruce Halderman, or sold to her for the vast sum of 5 cents apiece, over 100 million sheephead, all of which were planted under those trees. If it hadn't been for me, she wouldn't have had a garden, and it's no wonder it looks pretty good, because those sheephead were in there in multitudinous numbers. I was not under the impression that they all went into the garden. I used to think that people ate them. And Mother never disabused me of it because I would have had my feelings hurt so badly they never would have recovered. I felt that I was the provider of food for all the people in Naples, and they ate sheephead regularly, which I caught at the end of the pier with sand fleas, which I dug up out of the beach. Now, when you got past the Bruce Halderman house, which was right here, then there was the General William Halderman house. And the Bruce Haldermans and the General William Haldermans were not getting along. They didn't get along together. Everybody knew that they did not get along together. They had what was known as an old-fashioned feud, and the Bruce Haldermans didn't speak to the William Haldermans, and neither did their servants. It was a very formal lack of communication. I never found out what the trouble was, but it had something to do with the Louisville Courier-Journal. And they never made it up, as far as I know. Mr. Bruce Halderman and General William Halderman remained uncommunicative all their lives. But they had their houses right smack next to one another because that's where they built them during the happy days when they were speaking to one another. And then after them There wasn't anything until you got sort of midway between those houses and Mrs. Hamill's house, which was the furthest down the beach. There was another house right there, sort of an Italian stucco house with a tile roof, and I cannot for the life of me remember who owned it. They weren't here very much, and they weren't on my sheephead route, so I cannot remember. I've tried my best whose house they were. Then the next house, which was a good 4 or 5 blocks from hers, was the Hamill house. And Mrs. Hamill lived there with her sister, Mrs. Holloway. And then from there on down to Gordon's Pass, there wasn't anything. That was all there was on that side, on the beach. On the other side, there was a house right, when you came down the pier, right to your left, there was a little house there, then an open lot, then another house that the Timpkins lived in, then the Pullings house, then an empty lot, and then Coquina Cottage that we rented the first year we came down here, and then the house next to that we eventually built. And then there was a little road that came down between us and the next house who belonged to Mrs. Lesher. He was a great friend of mine. She's a great bridge player, and they played bridge constantly. And then after you got past those houses, at that time, that's all there were till you got down to just about, 2 miles down, I think it was 2 or 3 miles down from the pier, was a little cluster of 3 houses. And the Garners lived in one, and I cannot remember who lived in the other 2. But that was what was on the beachfront. And that was all. Now, back of our house was the swamp. When you came down out of our house, you turned around and started back into inland, and there was a road between Mrs. Lesher's house and our house, made of sand. And right on both sides of the road was a great big swamp. It was about the size of, 2 city blocks, and it went all the way down toward the pier back of the Pullings house. And it was a real honest-to-God Florida swamp. It had alligators in it, and it had moccasins, lots of moccasins. And it scared most people to death. The colored servants didn't particularly like it. They had some feeling that someday an alligator was going to come out of there and eat them. I never saw an alligator come out and eat anybody, but I did see some alligators about that long, and there was supposed to be one whopper in there. That legend had it, kind of like the Loch Ness monster that nobody ever saw, but he was supposed to be 12 feet long. Now, whether or not he was there, I don't know. He and I were not friends. Back of the swamp, you got into solid ground again, and that's where our cow lived. We had a cow and a whole bunch of chickens, and the cow gave the proper amount of milk for us, and the chickens laid the eggs, and there we were for the winter. And of course there was no communication. The first year we were down there weren't any telephones. Then they finally got the kind that's nailed up to the wall that crank and crank and crank and crank and crank, and it makes a terrible noise in someone's house, and they finally answer it. No, they can't hear you. That's the kind of thing. But that was that kind of a telephone. Didn't do a whole lot of good, but anyway, it was there. And then that was the story. And there was only one road back of the houses. When you came in, you either walked down the beach if you were invited for dinner, or you took the one road which went past the hotel and went straight on down toward Gordon's Pass, and that was the road that went behind the few houses that were on the beach on this side, and they would go down there, turn right, go to the house. And that was that, and that was all the roads there were. That was it. There were some streets here in town. Mrs. Ed Creighton lived on one of them, which was kind of parallel to the street in front of the hotel. One store called the Commissary. It had everything. It really was the most wonderful store that ever was. It had absolutely everything that everybody wanted. As far as I was concerned, it was perfect because it had lots of fishing tackle, and that's all I cared about. And I really did love to fish. Now, the people that were down here were pretty extraordinary then, just as they're pretty extraordinary now. The Bruce Haldermans, Mrs. Halderman was a lovely white-haired woman, really very handsome, and Mr. Bruce was another very handsome guy, and they had a lovely daughter named Anne Bruce Halderman, whom I remember. She was about my older sister's age and had as little to do with me as she could arrange, but she had to have something to do with me because she was looking after the yard, and I was constantly coming down to the yard, dragging my miserable little collection of glassy-eyed sheephead that I thought in my rosy dreams Mrs. Bruce Halderman was going to have for dinner that night. She did not have them for dinner, I gather. She put them under the palm trees, but they certainly did a hell of a job on the palm trees, I'd say. Certainly did. And